The city of Calgary says repair to that broken water main is taking longer than expected. It doesn't think it's going to have an exact date for when water restrictions will be lifted for a few days yet.
The thing to remember here is that time is something we need to ensure that our water supply remains safe and that it comes back consistently.
The city released this timeline showing the state of repair, sort of where they are, and those milestones, the crucial steps that lie ahead when repairs, when flushing, and when testing will be carried out. Officials hope to be able to share more information by the middle of next week. The city also released a photo of crews removing the damaged section of the water main. That exposed area they're working on just to allow for additional maintenance, that adds to the repair timeline. The boil water advisory for Bowness in the northwest of the city, that was lifted earlier this week, but the other water restrictions remain in place. The ban on external or outside water use, watering lawns, filling pools, and washing cars, for example, that is still not allowed. So again, still no clear idea for when this will all be resolved. And even though we've been covering this on a daily basis, we thought we'd spend some time today sort of looking at the issues in greater detail. And we're going to do so with Kerry Black, who's a civil engineering professor and the Canada Research Chair in Integrated Knowledge, Engineering and Sustainable Communities at the University of Calgary. Professor, welcome to our program.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, as I've been describing what's been going on in Calgary, I've been using the word catastrophic on numerous occasions. Is that the correct characterization for what we're seeing?
I think that's a pretty good characterization. I think it was this is a really massive event that not a lot of people would have expected. And so catastrophic is a pretty good word to use to describe it.
What is the most unexpected aspect of this for you?
The fact that it happened on a main feeder line. So those main feeder lines are the pieces that connect the city to your water system. And so you don't often expect failures of this magnitude on that main line. And often as engineers, we're trained to look to ensure that we have failure when it occurs. It's not something major and catastrophic. We have warning signs that tell us first. That's not necessarily what happened in this case. So when something of this magnitude happens on a main feeder line that feeds a big portion of the city, that's something that, causes a great deal of alarm and asks us to relook at what's the state of our infrastructure across the rest of the city.
I'm going to come to that in just a second, but you raised something that struck me as well. The fact that we understand, or to this point anyway, that there was no forewarning on all of that. That was a surprising aspect, which maybe we can talk about in a little bit more detail. But also, what would seem to me as an outsider, the relative newness of this feeder main. The mayor said this is a pipe that had a life expectancy of 100 years, but this was only about 50 years old. So was that also a surprising aspect to you?
In some ways, yes. But as you can imagine, every city in North America has thousands of kilometers of pipe underground. The city of Calgary has over 16,000 kilometers of pipe. And so are you aware of what's happening at every stretch of that pipe? That's a different conversation. This pipe, yes, was it, had it reached its design capacity? No. And that's what's really causing a lot of, interesting conversations about what exactly is going on and what do we know about what happened and what didn't happen. I think people are looking to have an answer right away. But when you've got something underground, it takes a little bit of time to figure out what exactly is the root cause of that.
And what are the key questions for you that need to be answered, both in the short term and then longer assessment?
Well, I think you'll get the answers, structurally on what happened to the pipe, and we'll get to the bottom of what caused it. For me, looking forward, it's really about asking ourselves across Canada, are we prepared for these kinds of things to occur? Because the reality is what happened in the city of Calgary is not a city of Calgary issue. It's a all of Canada problem. We should expect something like this to happen in all of our cities. And so are we prepared to deal with that when that comes up? Are we ready to tackle those problems when they occur? Is the everyday Canadian ready to reduce its water use if they need to?
That also was something that stuck with me because, again, Calgary's mayor said that Calgary is a leader in Canada for having the fewest water main breaks. And I was thinking if this could happen in Calgary, what must be the situation across the country? How do you think Canadians view infrastructure, Professor?
I think it's safe to say most Canadians don't really care that much about their infrastructure, and that's because half the time you can't see it. And usually what happens with infrastructure is it's the first thing, that you rely on. So when it breaks, it's the first thing that you'll complain about, but it's the last thing you want to pay for. And that's a huge problem with infrastructure. It costs a lot of money to maintain our infrastructure. The average Canadian doesn't necessarily want to pay for it. And so we don't pay that much for our water in the grand scheme of things. And we don't pay that much in terms of how we maintain our infrastructure. And so it's a really challenging space to work within, because it's something that we rely on so heavily as Canadians, but we don't necessarily value that infrastructure in the way that we rely on it until something happens.
There are always, pomp and ceremony announcements when something's being built, a new bridge or something like that. But the money that goes to maintain said infrastructure, bridge or otherwise, as you say, it's perhaps not as public, not as great of priority, certainly doesn't perhaps grab the interest of the Canadian public. But now we have the situation, and it is a reminder. What do you think are the lessons for not just Calgary, for other municipalities, and for Canadians in all of this?
Yeah, this is a real eye-opening moment for, I think, a lot of Canadians. So first and foremost, how much money are we putting towards our infrastructure, and are we all prepared to put a bit more into it? Because the reality is, aging infrastructure in the Canadian context, we've got a big problem. It's a ticking time bomb in a lot of places that we're not prepared to deal with. And so funding for infrastructure is huge. And you can't expect municipalities to take that all on their own. The provincial government and the federal governments have to keep reinvesting more and more dollars into it. That's a big part of it. The second part for me, I think, is this going to be a moment for Canadians to recognize that our relationship with water needs to change. We use it in ways that are quite wasteful at times. And so hopefully this is, going to force people to realize that we can use our water more sustainably, that we don't need to run the tap for minutes at a time to get it to the right temperature, and to recognize how much we rely on that water, because in this exact moment, there's many communities across Canada that don't have access to safe, clean drinking water, many Indigenous communities, First Nations across Canada on boil water advisories. So hopefully this wakes Canadians up. I think the lesson here would be, let's think about how prepared we are for water emergencies, because whether it's a water main break or a drought, we're going to have to face these problems sooner or later. So the hope is that we all learn from it and we don't necessarily return to the status quo.
Professor, thank you so very much for the time and perspective today. We're a long way from getting this resolved wholly, so hopefully we can have another conversation, many more questions as we look to this issue and beyond. And I'd appreciate your coming back. So thanks for today.
Thank you so much.